Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Open Minds podcast, folks. I've covered medical assistance in dying in great detail, and I'm so honored today to have the Chief Coroner of the Ontario government, Dr. Dirk Heyer, with me. As the province's top official in death investigations, Dr. Heyer leads the Office of the Chief Coroner, whose mandate is to ensure that no death is overlooked, concealed, or ignored. The investigations don't just determine how someone has passed, but they aim to also prevent similar deaths in the future. Dr. Heyer's work includes leadership in pediatric death review, child maltreatment evaluation, and forensic pathology. He's also the chair of the Ontario MAiD Death Review Committee. And folks, you've heard me talk about this at length with Dr. Ramona Coelho. And it's the body here in Ontario tasked with reviewing all MAiD deaths across the province. And after reading the reports, I'm struck with this question of whether or not Ontarians are choosing MAiD because they feel they have potentially no other choice. And how does that factor into their decisions? Dirk, thank you so much for joining me. What were some of the surprising findings from the reports that surprised you going in and seeing what happened at the end of them?
Yeah, just as a quick oversight or overview of what we do. So, as you talked about in the opening, our role is to understand the circumstances of death and then make recommendations if we can to prevent further deaths in the future. As you can imagine, our involvement with the Medical Assistance in Dying program is not completely consistent with that because people have died, and the MAiD program is to support end-of-life choice and end-of-life decisions for people who are suffering intolerably. So we were tasked by the legislature to provide oversight for medical assistance in dying, and we are one of the more robust ones in the country. And we evaluate each death that's reported to us for potential concerns, but with a goal to help to improve MAiD practice. So how can we provide learnings and opportunities for reflection to those who provide or assess or participate or are thinking about medical assistance in dying? So we have a team of 9 nurses that review each death. And then we'll speak with families to hear their perspectives or concerns. And then trends and themes that are identified through their work, we bring those to the MAiD Death Review Committee, which is a committee of 16 various professionals who help to, based upon individual cases which we feel represent potential themes or trends, they review those to provide their perspective and then lead to recommendations. I have to say I haven't been too surprised by anything because we've been involved in this since 2016, since it started, and we've seen the evolution and the change over time. And I think what we brought the committee together to really help us have additional perspective. And so the value of the committee has brought those diversity and perspectives forward to allow us to think about how can we make recommendations to inform improvements or changes or enhancements to MAiD practice. Mm-hmm. I think if you think about what do I think about the challenges that have arisen from this, I think what I've been surprised by is the emotional and passionate response to some of the reports that we have, mm-hmm. and how some people have taken snippets of the reports and use that to support their positions, as opposed to looking at the context of the reports. So a bit surprised by that. Not necessarily, but I was a bit surprised by that. Maybe more I was hopeful that that broad context would have been brought forward. So I think that's one of the observations that I would share.
What are some of the snippets, Dirk, that you've seen used that potentially misrepresent the broader context within the report?
Yeah, I think what happens is it's isolated on an individual issue within an individual case.
Right.
And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be brought forward. That's not what I'm saying, mm-hmm. but it's within the context. So the things that we've brought forward, while they are trends and themes that we see, they in fact are the small number within a context of death. So one is significant. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to minimize anything here, but it's looking at within that individual case or that death or that review, there's an issue that really was concerning or surprising about how legislation was followed or something. But when you looked at the context of the case itself and how did they bring other perspectives and other thoughts and other analysis, then looking at that isolated piece may not have been representative of the full eligibility that that person had. And did it actually reflect specifically on how that death was not managed or that MAiD provision was not managed effectively?
Right. And, for those that are less aware, there are two tracks for MAiD here in Canada, one where death is reasonably foreseeable and track two where death is not reasonably foreseeable. And Dirk, when you look at the two tracks, track two lends itself to those inquiring into the very specific cases. Although when you look at the numbers holistically, track two represents a small fraction of total MAiD cases across the country.
Absolutely, and far more complex. And so that's where we see challenges with the uniqueness of each circumstance and each person. So they have a variety of different illnesses in many situations that have led to suffering on from their perspective, and have a longer period of time of that suffering with what would be defined as not a fatal illness. So it's not an illness that would be expected to lead to somebody dying. And so the complexities that occur with a chronic and ongoing illness, complexities such as ability to be employed in a way that they wish to be employed, financial challenges, support services because of the challenges that they're facing, availability of those, the navigation of the healthcare system, sometimes housing. All of those complexities occur more often when you have challenging circumstances.
Right.
And so how the two intersect is an important thing for people to think about in MAiD practice. And that's the kind of recommendation that we may bring forward is look at the person holistically, look at the potential circumstances that they have, try to figure out, is there opportunity to improve those circumstances? And in thinking about how do you assess that person as a whole person. So I think that's some of the learnings that we've made and suggested. So that gives you an example of the complexities of the circumstance, the time that is required to think about things, and then the multiple different areas to explore and potentially offer suggestions for additional services or additional care, which may not be available. Sometimes they aren't available. And so how you navigate that with the patient is something that the providers and assessors think through. And we bring some of these examples forward to help people to reflect and think about how to do that.
Dirk, I know you're not a legislator, but you've been involved with MAiD since the beginning in 2016. And when we look across the world, Canada's very unique in the two tracks that we have. Can you help the listeners understand a little bit more why there was a push for track two? Because as I understand, track two wasn't initially in 2016. I think it came later. And I understand it's also a result of various interest groups who pointed to intolerable suffering may not occur, just in case you have stage 4 cancer, as an example.
Yeah, as you say, I'm not a legislator, but my understanding is that there were individuals who were suffering intolerably and felt that it was incorrect and in fact unconstitutional that they weren't able to avail themselves of an opportunity for medical assistance in dying with their what they believe to be incurable illness, disease, or disability, and intolerable suffering, that if it had been a fatal disease, they would have been entitled to be eligible for MAiD. And they brought that to the courts, and the courts recognized that in Quebec, and the federal government recognized that as a concern and changed the legislation in response to that. So I think it was that was the lead towards it. And so that gave, and they changed. So track one, as you said earlier, something like an end stage cancer circumstance, which I think many in society understand. And from what I've heard, I don't know, but what I've heard is that would be generally something that public opinion is supportive of. People who have tried all the different treatments for a disease that's causing significant difficulties and you are going to pass in the terminal period. That would be not uncommon. But then the others who are suffering differently is where the track two. So there's different safeguards as well.
Yeah.
So the legislation is set up. I think it's important to recognize that it's difficult to translate a legal document, so an amendment to the Criminal Code of Canada, into medical practice. And so legislation, as in any legislation, never defines everything. It provides a framework for decisions and a framework for how do I do the coroner's work, for example, totally separate than MAiD. But how do we do death investigation? Well, it doesn't indicate, well, on moment A, you must do this, you must do that.
Right.
It provides a framework that within expertise and knowledge and science and study, we learn what are the best practices to apply within that framework of legislation. So similarly in MAiD, the legislation has a framework, but there's some very rigid and clear safeguards. But how those are all developed into practice is challenging because medical practice doesn't typically arise from legislation. Medical practice typically arises from illness, and you think about treatments and you learn from it. So this is not a bit, it's a different way of medical practice being developed.
Dirk, when I started exploring MAiD, the comments were pretty wild on both sides. One saying, the government's trying to end us. There's a population control aspect. And then on the other side, people were like, this is my right. I have every right to select MAiD. You mentioned rigid controls within the framework. For those that are less aware, can you speak to one or two that exist that the broader public just may not be aware this actually exists within the framework?
Well, there's a number of things. So there's expectations. So you have to meet 4 criteria that you have to have the incurable illness, disease, or disability. Number 2, you have to be intolerably suffering. Number 3, in the first one, you have to, well, all of them, you have to have the clear capacity and ability to consent to a healthcare proceeding. And number 4, as I said, the intolerable suffering. And so all of those things need to be in place. Then in other circumstances, as far as the safeguards go, there needs to be a witness. And that witness needs to be independent of you. So it can't be someone who would be your beneficiary. There has to be 2 healthcare professionals independently looking at things. And in track 2, needs to be 90 days at least of time while people are considering other options, and that healthcare providers who are doing the assessing have to have either knowledge of the illness or seek expertise from somebody knowledgeable in that illness. And those alternatives need to be offered to the person.
Right.
And they have to seriously consider those. So that's a number of things that we wouldn't necessarily apply in medicine. So if you think about consent, for example, when going for surgery on my knee, so I would sign the consent, but the doctor would witness it. Well, that can't happen because the doctor is the one who's providing the care. They can't do that. And it can't be my spouse either. So a substitute decision maker can't do those signatures because of the potential for the risk of potential beneficiaries benefiting from it. So those are some examples of some of the rigid things.
And Dirk, this is, I think, the precipice of the difference too, because again, some would say, Christopher, there are rigid controls over MAiD. My father tried to get it, my grandfather tried to get it, and they were denied because they didn't meet certain criteria. And then others said, my grandfather was under duress and was fast-tracked through MAiD. And so there seems to be a spectrum of the implementation sometimes. And to your earlier point, sometimes people latch on to that one case as a justification for the broader MAiD system as a whole.
And one can completely understand that.
Right.
This is somebody's life. This is a person. This is a person whose life ended. And so it completely understanding why people would recognize that as a significant event. And that falls within their own perspectives, their own upbringings, their own backgrounds, their own worship. There's many different things that can impact the decisions around MAiD, and it's very emotive, it's very challenging, and it's very final. I mean, it is final. Well, there's lots of people. There's people that may debate whether it's final, but in my view, it's final, but that and it's very significant, and it's the person making the decision. So family members may not agree with their loved one's decision, but it is the person's decision. And so that also can lead to some challenges and conflicts with the family. Not conflicts, but conflicts in the thinking and the approach. And so those are very challenging circumstances.
Certainly.
And,
And then, yeah.
and whose decision about quality of life? Like whose mine towards Christopher's? I embrace Christopher's. Let's be honest. But but in all seriousness, it's like whose quality of life is what, and different people have different views on that as well, which we should all be understanding and respecting.
Certainly. And then of course there's, stress and anxiety that can factor in, obviously, when it's coming to these types of decisions. Dirk, you mentioned something really interesting, which is, understanding that other forms of care must be provided or identified to be provided. It's interesting when I look at the reports, especially on marginalization. We look at Track 2 recipients. Some are more likely to reside in more marginalized areas of the province. And, as an outside observer, how do you square that circle when there are people who are living in lower income communities that potentially is factoring into their decision?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to know. But because this question came forward, we try to answer questions. Sometimes we can answer them with clarity, sometimes we can't. And so what we did is we looked at marginalization indexes that have been developed that look at neighborhoods, and you're talking about one where material factors are present, and we utilized a matching system. So where the person who had received MAiD lived, we matched to the postal codes of the marginalization index, and we identified that a greater percentage of Track 2s lived in the neighborhood, but it doesn't speak to the individual. So it still makes it very challenging to speak to the individual. And when you look at other healthcare issues, we see a similar finding. And so it doesn't give us any concrete information. It gives us a view and something to explore further, but we don't have the details specifically on the others, because what would be most helpful to answer that question is the individual. So collecting that information on the individual and then doing an aggregate analysis of it. So right now, this is a potential view into it, but a potential view that I think requires more study. So back to your question, I mean, these are challenging questions. And so because we've observed that potential, that's why we raise it as a conversation for providers and assessors to reflect upon. Because if there are challenges, then is there an opportunity for those challenges to improve or to reduce their suffering, make their lives different, and be to a situation where they would be not wishing to proceed with MAiD. So that's what we learned from this, is to reflect and to think about this without necessarily knowing that it is a definitive factor. It's a consideration and something people should be thinking about and people should reflect on, but we don't know from the data that we have right now that it's a definitive factor. I understand how people could interpret it that way. And I'm not trying to argue either way, but we don't believe it's a defined definitive factor based upon the information that we have. So hope that helps.
Yeah, and that's a great clarification too, Dirk, because I remember looking at California, who also introduced MAiD at the same time as Canada, which is actually quite interesting when you look at the two jurisdictions. I believe in California, they have the opposite issue where they have higher income individuals selecting MAiD or thinking about selecting MAiD. And it's a disproportionate number compared to middle income or low income earners. And so it very well could be that there's a lot of high income earners that are left with anxiety, stress, and depression that can lead them down that path. And so you're right. It's a factor, but it's not a defining factor, which is interesting.
And then in California, it could be, and I don't know this because we haven't looked at it at all. It could be the access to healthcare, right?
Right.
Some who are struggling with determinants of health have less accessibility to healthcare, or maybe limited on their accessibility for other reasons. That could be again contributing to their marginalization or resulting from their marginalization. So I think it is difficult to know exactly what all that means. All that, it's a terrible way to say it.
Yeah.
What those things mean, and I think it's something we need to continue conversation with. We need to think about, and that's again circling back and being repetitive. And I recognize this, why we think it's so important for MAiD practice to be holistic and to think about the person and think about those aspects. Because there will be circumstances where, unfortunately, where a service is required, or sorry, a service may be beneficial, it's not available. And it's not available. Does that make it right? No, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But for that particular individual and that particular moment, within the context of everything, there are challenges that are difficult to face. But conversations, what's important, and reflection and thinking about alternatives are where we've encouraged further reflection.
You're right, Dirk. And I also want the audience to know that the challenges that medical practitioners find themselves in. I remember discussing this with 3 medical practitioners talking about studying spinal cord injury, those who've suffered spinal cord injuries. And within the first few weeks of diagnoses, 100% are very, very suicidal. But with sustained exposure to focus groups, group mental health talk therapy, etc., suicidal ideation went down dramatically and most adapted to their new life. But that's a really hard thing to pitch to somebody who's just sustained an injury, making them a quadriplegic. And so it's challenging to suggest a treatment to someone when ultimately it is their decision. And in that circumstance, we can empathize why they would want to, see a natural end to their life.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 points out of that. One is most. So you don't know who that would be. So the opportunity is provided to all,
right?
Logically and empathetically and care, providing care to it. But then the other thing is, it's not about just saying this is what's available to you. It also is thinking about how do you help the person to recognize that. And as you said, some peer groups, those who have expertise, those who have knowledge, understanding where the perspective is, working together to help people to gain confidence that this could be something that would be worthwhile for them. But absolutely, it's this balancing and MAiD, certainly in the way that the courts first looked at it, was driven by autonomy in the decision, driven by that is weighed out, might be a greater importance in many people's minds, that it's my decision and I have the ability to make that decision, irrespective of whether other things you think, or I think, or other people think should be provided or could be provided. Is still the strength goes to the autonomy of the thought, and that understand that. But again, we are bringing together the perspective of maybe there's other ways to think, other as far as more holistic, not more holistic, additionally holistically way to think about things.
Dirk, you mentioned a few things that I want to pick up on. One being isolation and social isolation. I mentioned earlier track 2 MAiD cases represent approximately 4, sometimes even 5% of all MAiD cases across Canada, so a small percentage. However, social isolation is a large factor for many in track 2. I wanted to ask you about making decisions in track 2 if you're also socially isolated? Because I can imagine that is a major, do I now have autonomy if I'm socially isolated, if that makes sense, right? Like social isolation playing a factor into my decision. Is it truly an autonomous decision now?
Yeah, don't know until I'm talking with that person. And so I
Mhm.
think we can't say blanket yes or blanket no. I
Right.
think it really speaks to the individual circumstance and all of the other competing factors. So are they socially isolated because of a mental health challenge? Are they socially isolated because of a physical difficulty? Are they socially isolated because of their housing situation, their money situation? So
Mhm.
all of those things I think are important. And speaking back to when the assessment's occurring with the patient or the person who's requesting MAiD, to think about the potential for, does the social isolation contribute to their decision making? How does that contribute to what they're thinking and what they're asking about? How does that contribute to their suffering? So I think it's it's so important that we don't say the social isolation is impacting is it impacting their decision as part of your assessment and part of your evaluation? And there's two healthcare professionals who should be, or who must be, assessing. And those, in a track two situation, those two healthcare professionals are expected to be, well, they must talk to each other to understand whether the options for care were provided, and whether the person gave serious consideration. Now, having said that, in my very legislatively read words,
Yes.
the reality is, clearly that's interpretation. That would be interpreted by clinicians, assessors, providers. And we're not there at the time of those decisions. And so
Mhm.
we're encouraging in all, and CAMAP and others,
Mhm.
sort of Canadian Association of Medical Assessors and Providers, who have an education group, and others who are involved in MAiD, encourage this type of thinking in your assessment of a patient. So it's an important consideration, is what I'm long answer to your question, an important consideration, without determining that, because I think that's also um, unfair to the patient
Yeah.
to make that determination, and unfair to the providers and the assessors to say that will be
Mhm.
impacting. Could it be? Yes.
Right.
Is it? Don't know.
Right.
Should it be considered? For sure. So that, I think that gives you a bit of context again on that particular issue.
Dirk, you mentioned the association representing medical assessors. What have you seen as some trends, some things that they should be more considerate of during MAiD, or maybe gaps, areas that can be improved upon moving forward? You've been there since 2016. I'm sure you've seen quite a bit in when it comes to medical assessors in particular. I'm sure that there's so much pressure, of course, on their assessments. But how can we make sure that they're obviously more robust moving forward?
Yeah, I don't think we can say they're not robust. What I think is important is the recognition of the complexity, particularly of track two cases, and having colleagues, having experts, having a community of practice to be able to talk through and support their assessment of the individual illness, and then their assessment of the person. So,
Hmm.
a multidisciplinary team, if available, and
Hmm.
hard to find, like social work, some occupational therapy, psychiatry if necessary, psychology, others who can help to the care team that's already involved if they have a complex problem, the ongoing physician. So getting people together to think about
Hmm.
and understand and reflect on the person's request for MAiD, and is there other opportunities. So I think it's what I'm speaking of, and what we've seen is often the autonomous doctor and nurse practitioner. So they're solely practicing in the area, and then thinking about how to have greater resources from perspectives. Not so much, I'm not talking about money resources, I'm talking about
Yeah.
communities of practice. I think that's something that we've seen would be beneficial. I think we've also seen, along with that, the significant benefit in other provinces like Nova Scotia, for example, Alberta, BC, where there's care coordination processes that are specific to uh, helping patients navigate, helping patients access, helping patients be assessed in a consistent pathway. In Ontario, we're very big, and different areas approach have care coordination in different ways. So some hospitals are really good at it. Some it's in the community, and who can you reach?
Yeah.
And so some consistency in navigation and access and community of practices, I think, would be go a long way to support the challenges that not only do the patients face when they're making decisions like this or requests like this, but the practitioners who are sometimes without a lot of support and resources in helping think through it. So I think that it's thinking about this more in a broader clinical support way.
Dirk, and an association with that is the transparency in posting a lot more of that information publicly. One thing I've experienced online is the lack of information that many may have around MAiD, and then jumping to a conclusion because it's sensationalist, right? It's very sensationalist to say that the medical practitioners forced me into doing it or forced my father into it. And so understanding the complexity that goes into the assessment would help people understand a little bit more of what the assessors are faced with.
I agree with you, but I also, and I'm not very pessimistic about much. I'm a little bit pessimistic about the success of that because many aren't going to go to read that context. Yeah. And I can say our report's very robust.
Yes.
But very long. Mm-hmm. And so reading and taking time to read that to understand the full complexity and the context is difficult. Mm-hmm. And so it's a smaller number of people that I believe are reading them. Mm-hmm. And so doing something like a podcast with somebody named Christopher, I think is a very valuable thing because it allows people to understand and hear the conversation and to think a little bit differently about how they may be. But I also have a recognition that some are very, for good reasons, their own good reasons, are very firm on their views. And so even reading and learning may not change the views. I'm not being negative about them. I'm being respectful. That's their views. So it's not our role to change people's views either.
Right.
And so I think that there still will be some that have very firm views and will remain with those views for very, very solid rationale from their perspectives. And so I think it's a bit more complex than posting and doing things. But as you've probably seen from us and others, we try to get information out. We think it's important. Yeah. And we think it's important for people to have the opportunity to reflect and to think about what we've observed. And at times that's challenging because we do bring out information that does contribute to an emotive response at times.
Dirk, I wanted to spend some time chatting. You mentioned before about the data, and there's data integrity and the completion and completeness of the data. And again, one thing I find online, and perhaps what we'll see in future Senate committee hearings, is the potential manipulation of the data to, achieve a certain end, certainly, but also the gaps in data. When I look internationally at other jurisdictions, there's a lot of data collected on the individual, income, language, linguistics, gender, ethnicity, all the things you can think of. But I recognize here in Canada, it can be very challenging to acquire that data from the recipient, especially when they're on a track 1 or 2, but also to what ends. And so can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges in obtaining the data from recipients?
And so if you think about healthcare and healthcare system, generally speaking, healthcare system is to provide a health service. It's not to collect data.
Right.
So it's not the role to collect data. That would be more researchers or more other information. Having said that, so medical assistance in dying as a healthcare process in Ontario and Canada, the amount of information that must be collected is way more than anything anywhere else in the health system. So there's a substantial amount of information that's being collected. And so do I think there could be more? Yes, but I think that has to be balanced. And I'm not an assessor or provider, so this is difficult for me to comment upon because I'm not there during the interviews. So
Right.
can you tell me what is your gender preference? Can you tell me what was your sex at birth? Can you tell me what is your income? Can you tell me were you employed for 12 years? Obviously, I'm getting so it's difficult to do that, and I think the other jurisdictions probably have I don't know this, but have the ability to get that from other ways as opposed to asking the person. There might be some linkage
Right.
approaches. So it's how the data is accessed and brought forward. So you saw what I talked about earlier, which was we linked from the postal code to the marginalization index to try to give an idea and a perspective to the answer to the question. But again, back to where we talked about, to have that in individual, then we would have to have specific questions. And we're talking about assessing people who are suffering, end of life, and how much time would be spent. It's not about the time, but it's the meaningfulness of the time and asking those kinds of questions. And to that person, to what end is it? So I understand that. So this is the balance.
Right.
And I'm not advocating either way because as you probably imagine, I think data is extremely important and it helps to inform and to define or to suggest further study. But I think it's not as easy as we're suggesting. I think that's part of the challenge.
Dirk, I wanted to end our conversation in our last segment talking about the future of MAiD, because as I gather and what I've been able to see and assess online and through the research, again, there's a lot of misinformation there, I think, around MAiD. And I'm hopeful that through conversations like these, that can help fill those gaps of awareness that people may be less aware of. But from your perspective as the chief coroner, what are you hopeful over the next 5 to 10 years from both the province and the federal government moving forward on this issue?
Yeah, not so much about the province and the federal government. It's more about medical practice. And what I've seen and our team has seen is a continuing maturing of MAiD practice. And I want to separate that a little bit from the tragic loss that families and people have suffered with the death of their loved ones. But it's the overall practice that I'm seeing more and more moving to more holistic assessment, more holistic care, to thinking about the complexities in a um, much more thorough way. So I'm seeing that. I've seen that over time, and more expertise. I think there's more to do, particularly in Ontario. And again, I'm not sure that's government per se, but health system government would need to support. But health system navigation, responsiveness, specialization, really making this fall within other areas of healthcare, and it's starting to come that way. So it's something that occurs at end of life. Obviously, it's end of life, but how does it fit together within the trajectory of the patient's life and death, but within medicine, as opposed to being something that's new, something that's emotive, something that's challenging, and always kind of that circling around it, like swirl around it in some way. It should be, doesn't mean it needs to be accepted, doesn't mean it needs to be embraced by everybody, but recognizing that this is something that is clearly part of Canada right now, part of the way things are going, and a choice that people are making, and we're not seeing across our the work that we do that this is a choice that people are being forced into. We're seeing this as choices people are making, some in very difficult circumstances, but that really is not the majority in any way whatsoever. It would be a vast, and those circumstances still the exact role they have, we don't see, because the overall assessment uh, is so good in so many circumstances. So back to your question, I think it's the healthcare system recognizing the continued need for continuous improvement, just as anything else in health system, and how this falls together with that, and how do we build additional expertise, additional support, and including that into the opportunity for thorough and holistic assessments of people as they're having this conversation, because this is a conversation that people are going to have.
Yeah.
And that's a reality. And to suggest that that's not a reality, I think would be naive, and in fact would be disrespectful. But once people understand how does it all fit together within the health system, then there's the opportunity to help those people at that time in a variety of different ways. And whether that's meeting with them and explaining what medical assistance in dying is and clearing up that misperception that maybe from their own reading or their own experiences. And then that allows them to make a decision. Oh, well, that's not what I was thinking. And that's not where I really want to go. And oh, thanks. Thanks for helping me out with this. Or, I mean, I'm being overly simplistic here.
Yeah.
Or, you know what? There's some whole bunch of complexities you have here. I've got some other people that I think would be helpful for you to talk to think this through. And after they think through all of that, and that's everybody's had chance to think and explore, and they decide to move forward, it would be a thoughtful, careful, which, as I say, the majority of the work that we see is that, in the work that we assess.
That's amazing, Dirk. I know we spent our entire time talking track 2. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up track 1. And I think what lends this thought of MAiD being forced on people is the numbers as we see year over year, track 1 growing. I think it's around 14 to 15% year over year. But to your point, understanding that, of course, it's charter set. It's section 7 of the charter, right? Individual right to life, liberty, and security of the person. But also making sure that even in track 1, that there's thoughtful analyses done on the individual for the next 10 to 15 years with MAiD going forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it absolutely makes sense because there are alternatives to MAiD as well, and those alternatives should be available for people to consider. And I think we've heard before that people think this is a failure of the health system. I don't think that way. I really don't think that way. I think that there are a portion of people, I don't know the numbers, I don't know generally, that this is something that is a decision that they've made in contrast to somebody who in the exact same circumstance would not make that decision. And so I think it's accepting isn't the word, recognizing and respecting that there are a portion within the population who are at end of life, that this is something that they want to make the decision of when they die. And that there isn't significant or specific curative treatments available. And that's okay that they want to make that decision, again, within the context of assessment and thoughtfulness and conversation. And then they make that decision. That's something I think those who conscientiously object or feel differently about MAiD also will respect that was that person's conscientious decision to proceed with MAiD. They don't have to, but I understand, again, I respect and understand the difference of views, but I think respect goes both ways, is what I'm trying to say.
That's great, Dirk. And, through this podcast, the more thoughtful and engaging conversations we can have about this, again, can help not only shed light for more people, but also, again, shed light on the complexity of the assessors and what they're tasked with as well. And then address the real considerations of what we can do to make this more transparent, even if it is a few people reading the report. At least it's there for people to see. And I'll link all the MDRC reports in the show notes as well. But Dirk, thank you so much for your time. We've covered so much ground here, and I appreciate your openness to discussing this very challenging topic that most don't want to talk about, but doing so with just an open willingness to say, you know what, this actually needs to be discussed further.
That's so important for all of the reasons that you've talked about. And I'm not suggesting that I know all or know lots, but these are the perspectives that I think absolutely what you say is for people to hear and listen. They don't have to agree with me. In fact, I'm open to different views because it allows me to think and learn, but it allows the reflection on what we've observed and what we've seen. And part of the reason we pulled together the MAiD Death Review Committee with a diversity of viewpoint was because we're of the belief that our full range of perspectives is so important to inform the recommendations that we're going to make. If we don't hear different views, then we're probably missing something.
Right.
And then we're also hopeful that the different views hear each other and to think and learn from each other. So, from our perspective, it really, I think, brings stronger recommendations, stronger perspective, and to the recommendations that we make.
Thanks, Dirk. And for those that are curious, the links to the reports are below. They are quite extensive, and I'd encourage everyone to look at the marginalized report in particular. There's some really interesting findings there. And again, I'm open to all the comments as well. So let me know what you think. And Dirk, I'd love to have you back on to discuss further MDRC reports together and learn some new things as we go through MAiD on this journey as a country.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me and the interest and allowing me to learn from you and to share with others.